Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on NOAA Digital Coast, an introduction to nature-based solutions for coastal hazards. My name is Ryan Blazik. I'm with Eagle's Environmental Support Division. I'm just going to be helping to facilitate a few things on the webinar today. And one of those is logistics. So we're going to go through a couple things here. In case you haven't joined us for our webinars before, or if you have, we have a couple things that are a little bit different today. You'll see a poll. Appreciate it if you could fill that out when you're logging in before we get started too far into the webinar. Also, all lines are muted during the webinar, so you'll be able to hear us, everything we're saying, but we won't be able to hear you. Please use the chat function, your Zoom toolbar, to communicate with us. Typically, in the past, I've used the question box, but we're going to be using the chat today, so please use that. And also, we're recording this webinar. This will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. You'll receive a link in a few days to that. So with that, I would like to invite Lauren Long and Bridget Lucier to our webinar today, and we'll kick this off.
Oh, thank you so much, Ryan. I appreciate the introduction. So my name is Bridget Lucier, and I am a coastal resilience specialist, and I sit here in Charleston, South Carolina, and I am with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. And we are going to hear from two NOAA trainers today, and I'm going to pass it over to Lauren Long. She is my counterpart, and she works for NOAA's Office for Coastal Management as well. And she is based in Honolulu. And actually, Lauren, let's look at these poll results. If everyone has had a chance to reflect on those poll results, Ryan, maybe you could generate the results so that we can see them. Okay, it looks like we have a pretty good diversity of interest in nature-based solutions or green infrastructure and why people are interested in that. Lessen the hazard impact, certainly environmental benefits was ranked very highly. Creating and conserving habitat. So this is great to see. And one of the great things about these nature-based solutions or green infrastructure is that they're really adaptable, and you can see that there are many different benefits. It's not just hazard impacts, it's not just habitat, but many different co-benefits that we can talk about today. And it is great to read all of the chats on who is calling in today. We have people from all over, so that is very exciting. So we are going to just continue on, and you just know that if you are having any questions or any trouble, please just use the chat to interact with us today. And we're going to use the chat function and not the question and answers function. So we'll just use the chat to interact. Please feel free to throw questions in there. If you're having any problems or any technical issues, please let us know. We'll have some folks who are working in the background to solve any of those issues. And our host today is the Michigan Coastal Program and the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And I'd like to turn it over to Melissa Latoski to welcome all of you and say a few words. There you go, Melissa. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Latoski. I am the Coastal Waters Coordinator in the Michigan Coastal Management Program. On behalf of the Michigan Coastal Management Program, I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I also want to extend big thanks to NOAA and our NOAA trainers, Bridget and Lauren, for helping us bring this training to Michigan, and our guest speakers, Amy Nowakowski from Huron Pines and Katie Grantham from the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. Before we dive into the webinar presentations, I want to give a quick introduction to the Michigan Coastal Management Program to explain who we are and how we can assist our coastal communities. The Michigan Coastal Management Program is part of a national program that was established in 1978 as a federal and state partnership with NOAA. The national program consists of a network of 34 states, islands, and territories with NOAA that protect America's fresh and saltwater coasts. Aligned with the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Michigan Coastal Management Program's mission is to protect, preserve, restore, enhance, and wisely develop the coastal natural resources and cultural heritage on the nation's longest freshwater coastline. As a national program, our underlying responsibilities are to act in the best interests of our coastlines. We have identified the following as our strategic goals: plan for growth and change, protect, preserve, restore, and enhance coastal ecosystems, and build partnerships of this shared resource. Our main objective is to connect people and communities to the Great Lakes. This slide outlines how we do our work. The coastal program has invested in staff to align with the 5 national focus areas, which include public access, community development, coastal hazards, coastal waters, and coastal habitat. We are committed to providing substantial technical assistance and strategic grant funding to assist our coastal communities' ability to understand risks and options to mitigate coastal hazards, create healthy habitats that provide for human use and enjoyment, support safe public access, and support resilient and sustainable coastal communities. This slide gives details on the grant funding the coastal program provides every year. Eligible applicants include coastal communities, regional planning agencies, educational institutions, tribal governments, and nonprofit organizations located within the approved programmatic boundary. We provide grants for planning projects and site-specific low-cost construction projects. Grant funding opportunities are released annually in September with a December application due date. And if you have any questions, our focus area coordinators are listed on our program webpage, but I also have their contact information on a slide at the end of the presentation. On the national scale, NOAA has identified the ability for coastal communities to prepare for and minimize risk to coastal hazards as one of the most important priorities to be addressed collectively. Community resilience is the ability to respond and bounce back from the ever-changing conditions of living on the Bay Coast. It is the goal of the coastal program to leverage resources and partnerships to build coastal community resilience. One method that can be utilized for building resilience is incorporating nature-based projects into our coastal communities. In Michigan, we have devised a pathway to resilience to help coastal communities develop innovative conceptual plans that utilize nature-based solutions. This pathway starts with providing technical assistance and trainings, like today's webinar, and transitions into planning and the development of conceptual plans with the eventual goal of having shovel-ready projects that can be implemented. We have a few upcoming opportunities to assist you on your pathway to resilience. The second part of this nature-based solutions for coastal hazards training, it will be an in-person training on September 15th in Gaylord. Registration will be going out soon for the training, so keep an eye out for that. We have an upcoming Coastal Leadership Academy with the Northeast Michigan Council of Governments in September. Our 2024 grant funding opportunity is being released in September. And we will also be offering federal infrastructure funding grants starting in 2023 for habitat restoration and land conservation. And this can include nature-based solution projects. And finally, to wrap things up, here is the Coastal Management Program team with everybody's contact information listed. I want to thank you all again for attending today's webinar. You're in for some really great presentations, and I'm going to be passing things back to Bridget.
Thanks so much, Melissa. I really appreciate that. So we are going to get started, and I'm going to just real quick get my slides up. I'll share my screen. And we are going to start off with our goal today.
Bridget, you're muted, so you're going to have to switch that in Zoom. Thanks.
Is that better? Thank you.
Sounds good.
All right, super. So today we're going to explore how to overcome coastal hazards with nature-based solutions. Like those coastal hazards could be flooding and erosion, and also how to overcome the implementation challenges that we're likely to get. And I noticed that we might be going back and forth between green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, and I'm using them a little bit interchangeably, and we don't want you to get caught up in the terminology. So just use whatever term when you're in the chat or in your own processes, whatever term works best for you, whatever resonates best with you and your audience. So that is, I just didn't want to cause any confusion. So that's what we're going to be, that's our goal. And then this is our agenda. So the first thing we'll do is just a minute, we'll debrief that part 1 exercise that you completed before coming today. and discuss everyone's hazards of concern, the ecosystem services, and green infrastructure practices or nature-based solutions that you were thinking through. And so you might want to have that worksheet handy. So if you want to pull that out. And then Lauren Long is going to briefly mention some keys to successful implementation of projects that we've learned over the years working and talking with experts like the folks that are going to be on the line today. So you can be listening for those keys to success while our two local speakers talk and during the question and answer session. And then we'll hear from those amazing experts. First, Katie Grantham from Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, or Semcog, and then from Amy Nowakowski with Huron Pines. And they'll both share information about projects that they're kicking off in different parts of the state to identify future nature-based solution projects and coming up with some design renderings for those, and then ultimately funding and implementing those projects. So Katie and Amy have been working on this project or these projects for a long time, so they'll share their NBS work they've done in the past and their lessons learned about those projects with you. And then after the talks, we'll move to a discussion and dive into the challenges and solutions and any other tips that Katie and Amy may have, and you'll have the opportunity to pose questions to them through the chat. And then to wrap up, I will share some helpful resources and future learning opportunities to help you take some next steps in your work. So let's just talk about part one. So part one, and I hope that everyone had a chance to do this. And if you would, if you went through the Nature-Based Solutions for Coastal Hazards Basics class, if you would share in the chat something that you learned or found interesting from part one. That way we can see what people got out of that. There's a lot of different ways to get something out of that training, and so we'd like to see what you got out of it. All right, let's see. I'm looking for. So Lauren put the link in there in case you need it, and I see someone has noted a challenge. All right. The training included the Great Lakes. Yes, thank you. We try to expand into the Fresh Coast and the Green Infrastructure Effectiveness Database. Thank you. That is a great resource. There are, I'm not sure, 350 something references in there about the effectiveness of nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. Helped you organize, yes. And I think that's really important. It is something that it's nice to have a process. All right, I broke down the thought process. Yes, exactly. Different scales, certainly. You can go from the project site scale all the way up to the watershed scale. All right, the financing for NBS construction, yes. And yep, an interdisciplinary approach, right? It's important to look at all the aspects. We can't just be in our silos. Great, thank you. Thank you, Frank. Just watching to see if any more chats come in. The case studies, good. I'm glad that you like that. That is wonderful. All right. Okay, now the financing of the construction. Yep, yep. Glad that that is helpful. Okay, well, it looks like the chat might be slowing down, so I'm going to go on down to look at the green infrastructure. So this is an example. Here we have a project kind of in a before and after state. So, and this is at Brandenburg Park, Brandenburg Park on Lake St. Clair. So this is a Great Lakes example where we had this eroding shoreline with a bulkhead that was failing, and that was replaced with native plantings, a little bit of fill, some planting, to just kind of create this transitional shoreline from kind of the higher level to the lower level. And it does encroach on the lake a little bit, so that's a factor to keep in mind. But that is an example of the kind of approach that you can have that is a way to use natural infrastructure in the environment to not just use bulkhead or use a steel wall or something like that, but you don't need to be using those techniques. So this is our approach, and this is how we talked through this in the training. If you went through part one, so we have this specific process, and we think about how to mitigate the coastal hazard using ecosystem services provided by implementing the right green infrastructure or nature-based solution process. So what that looks like, for example, is mitigating coastal erosion. Here we have this eroding shoreline, using the ecosystem service of wave attenuation by installing, for example, a living shoreline. So that is an example of what our approach looks like. So you can use a hybrid approach with a mix of rock and sand or engineered materials. So this is a living shoreline, and this is just one example. So I don't want you to think we're all just living shorelines. There are a lot of different strategies under nature-based solutions. So I want to talk about the ecosystem services. If you got to this piece in the training, in the part one of the training, we're going to talk about these ecosystem services that you learned about in that part one. So there are so many benefits or ecosystem services provided by nature, such as erosion control, coastal buffering, we have wave attenuation is called out here. And it's really important to understand what the coastal hazard that you're trying to mitigate is and what the ecosystem service that you need from nature to mitigate the hazard is. That will help you pick the right practice for your problem. So if you went through this part of section one, you saw that the ecosystem services are that key. For example, if your main goal is to reduce coastal hazards, you look at wave attenuation, erosion control, and then you also want to consider the co-benefits. So these co-benefits are a really key piece and a very appealing piece about nature-based solutions or green infrastructure. These can be aesthetics, water quality, recreation, just habitat value, so many other things other than erosion control or stormwater mitigation, those kinds of things. There's so many co-benefits, and these co-benefits can get a lot of people excited about your project that maybe weren't necessarily super pumped up about erosion control, but they may be like, wow, that's a beautiful native plant garden, or that's a gorgeous wetland project. So those co-benefits are really, really helpful for getting, making your practice very successful. So these green infrastructure practices, like we said, that can be a whole wide range of practices. We have dune restoration, and we have this one of these from the Milwaukee Green Seam, and then this is pervious pavers in the middle there, and the flooded part is for the impervious pavers. So lots of different options here, lots of different types of practices. We don't want you to get limited in these in what you're thinking of. It can be also just conservation. So it doesn't have to be a project, but you could just be conserving things. But lots of things: rock reefs, rock sills, wetland conservation, bioswales, green streets, street trees, on and on. So many, many, many different options. So in part one, you worked through this approach that we just talked about, and we have this example of that worksheet that is included in there. So I wanted to see what some of the hazards of concern and the locations that people are seeing issues that you are working through in your green infrastructure practice. So Lauren is going to stick an example in the chat of how we might want to see this. So what we're looking for is an example of what you were using and what you are looking to fix. So if there is like, for example, like what we'd like to see is the coastal hazard and the ecosystem service that you are interested in, maybe the location. So if you want to enter in the chat what the hazard of your concern, so there you go. So Lauren Long just put in stormwater runoff is the hazard that she's concerned about. What we need is water infiltration. And so, for example, you could install bioretention and pervious pavement. So if everybody could just take a minute and share your hazard of concern and your location, that'll give us a sense of the kind of challenges that you're facing and the kind of green infrastructure or nature-based solutions that you're seeking to implement. So I'm going to give everyone a few moments to enter that in the chat and see what we come up with. And if you don't have something off the top of your mind, just, yeah, stormwater runoff and water infiltration. Thank you. Ooh, sewage backup, SACE impacts, yes. All right. This is really helpful. Flooding, erosion, yep, that wave attenuation. All right, stormwater runoff, another one. Contaminants, erosion, river flooding, lots of erosion, hybrid, seems like a lot of stormwater runoff, flooding, and erosion problems. Okay, more shoreline erosion issues, pond infrastructure maintenance. definitely using artificial vegetation structures in other cases. That's very interesting. I am not familiar with that. That's something that I'd like to learn more about. Okay, so it looks like we have a lot of similarities. Oh, good. That's very cool. Your thesis research. I want to read it. So stormwater runoff is another one. Dune restoration, wonderful. Coastal erosion, dune restoration can be really effective toward that. So there's a lot of similarities here and then a lot of differences. We've got a lot of erosion concerns as well as stormwater ponds, stormwater runoff, controlling that, dune restoration, coastal erosion. So thank you everybody for entering those. Coastal flooding, this is great. So I know you've done your homework. This is super. Okay, so I wanted to just see, okay, so let me take a look and see what, yep, flooding, okay. So this is really, really helpful, and Lauren is going to start up here in just a moment, but I just wanted to give a chance before, you know, as we're going through to see if anyone had any questions about part one before I turn it over to Lauren to share some keys to success. Just gonna keep an eye on that. I don't see any questions coming in. Okay, I see one question, ISO or ASTM? I do not have an answer to that question. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren Long and we'll see if we can track down an answer to that question in the chat. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Bridget. And yes, David, if you want to spell those acronyms out, we might be able to answer those questions. Bridget, could you mind continuing? Did you just stop sharing your screen?
I did.
Just so you're aware, Lauren, we can see your screen. It looks like we're still in, need to go into slideshow mode.
Okay, just making sure you can hear me now too.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. So let's get back to where Bridget left off here. All right. So now that you all have gone through part one of the training, you're familiar with the basic concepts and practices associated with green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And so I'm going to briefly mention some keys to successful implementation before we dive in with our local experts to hear about some of their experiences overcoming challenges and their tips for success. So Bridget talked with you about some of the ecosystem services or benefits from nature that are provided by green infrastructure on multiple scales, but it's clear that in order to effectively implement these concepts, there are many challenges that we must overcome. And so these are some of the challenges you all provided in registration. So we heard from you that you have challenges around cost and funding, including maintenance costs, which we hear this a lot. And you also have, and we're going to talk at the end today about a funding webinar that is going to be available specifically for the Great Lakes. So hopefully we can help a little bit with that challenge. You all mentioned a need for improved knowledge around nature-based solutions, including how to identify and prioritize options that reduce coastal hazards. And we have several NOAA resources that we'll send out in a follow-up email about that can kind of help you with that piece of looking at your coastal hazards and looking at where you can identify areas for green infrastructure. You also mentioned needing information on the efficacy to help build confidence in decision making, and that was also shared in the chat a little bit ago. And then also information on long-term maintenance. You all shared challenges around getting community buy-in. So this includes engaging community members and property owners to see the added value of nature-based solutions, helping to also reduce the general risk of fear and the unknown in order to implement nature-based solutions rather than your traditional manicured lawn. And then someone provided in registration a great solution to kind of reinvigorate a previously successful Green Infrastructure Champions program. And we actually just had a different training yesterday where that was kind of a big key to success that someone shared, is just having those champions is really important in helping to get community buy-in and support. And then you all mentioned a need around political support, so that there's a lack of understanding at the local government and decision-making levels that can interfere with implementation. And then also a challenge with nature-based solutions not fitting into that regulatory framework and really requiring regulators to think outside the box. So we'll also be sharing a resource at the end kind of around local codes and ordinances and how you can kind of align those with nature-based solutions to hopefully help with that challenge. So it's super important that we figure out solutions to these challenges if we want to be successful. So our hope today is that you come away with ideas to address some of these challenges. And in a moment, I'm going to be turning it over to our local experts, Katie Grantham and Amy Navikoski, who will be sharing projects that they have implemented, talking about some of their challenges and lessons learned and some of their keys to success. But we have talked to experts for years during these trainings, and we do know that some of the things you see on the slide here are keys to success that we need to think about. So we know that in order to be successful, your designs should really be grounded in science and engineering. They should really consider the local landscape when you're choosing which projects to put on the ground. Your project should really be aligning with community goals, plans, and regulations to help justify those projects if they're aligned with those planning efforts. Your project should be cost effective, of course. It has to be maintained. Green infrastructure, gray infrastructure, all is infrastructure, so it all has to be maintained. Of course, when you do that, heavy maintenance is going to vary depending on if you're implementing green infrastructure or gray infrastructure. So green is obviously we're going to have some heavy maintenance kind of on the front end while we're trying to establish the practice, and then less kind of maintenance as we go forward. And then with gray infrastructure, a lot of times you have a lot of maintenance on the back end. So, but it all requires maintenance, so something to consider. It's also important to engage your stakeholders so that you're reflecting their community values. And that's a good way to kind of get that community buy-in, is if you're engaging your stakeholders up front, you're asking them what they care about. Because, like Bridget mentioned, the great thing about green infrastructure is it's not all about coastal hazards. There's so many other benefits that you get from those practices. So listening to your stakeholders and your partners and your community members and making sure that you're incorporating what they care about into the projects is going to just help achieve greater success and more buy-in. And then also, of course, building sustainable partnerships. You need to build partnerships over the long term that can help you, where you can leverage their knowledge and their resources, because we can't do it all. So it's nice to be able to parse out kind of different pieces of projects based on what people's strengths and their niche. So building those, establishing those partnerships that you can leverage over the long term is really important. So be listening for these tips when you hear from Katie and Amy, and also during our panel discussion, we'll dive a bit deeper into some of these keys to success. And then during part one, Bridget showed you the front page of the worksheet from part one. Hopefully you flipped it over and you saw the back side of this worksheet. And so here you probably documented some of your challenges. And this would also be a good spot to document some solutions, as you hear from Katie and Amy today. So just wanted to make sure you remember that you have this great worksheet to add some notes to and to think about some of your solutions. So before I turn it over to Katie, just wanted to make sure there aren't any additional questions. But please, I'm trying to see if I can see our chat. But Bridget, maybe you can chime in if you see any questions in the chat.
There is one question from David Benjamin, but it is about the standards on NBS and how to design them, and then gets into a question about benefit cost analysis and what type of economic analysis. And I think that might be something that, my goodness, we could spend a very, very, very long time talking about the different ways to do economic valuation on the ecosystem services. So I would love to follow up if that's okay, or Lauren, unless you wanted to explore that question.
Yep, I think we could, a couple of things. So on the design standards, Bridget will be sharing a resource at the end that has some designs for cold climates. So we will be sharing a few resources around that. When it comes to cost benefit analysis and economic assessments, we do have several resources from NOAA's Office for Coastal Management on those topics. And we're actually in the process of designing a training around cost benefit analysis because we know that's a big barrier for folks. So I am happy we can share, we don't have those built into our presentation today, but in the follow-up email, I will go through and make sure we include resources on those different pieces. And then of course, we're happy to follow up with you offline and chat more about the economic assessment resources that we have. And we also have economists on staff that provide technical assistance. So we can definitely connect you with them. So yep, I will include some resources in our follow-up email, but then don't hesitate to reach out if you want to chat more and get connected with some economists from our office. And of course, if anyone has additional questions, just put them in the chat for sure. And Bridget and I will answer those as we turn it over to Katie and Amy. So now we'll hear from our amazing experts, Katie Grantham from the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments and Amy Nowakowski from Huron Pines. And they're going to both share information about some new projects that they're kicking off in different parts of the state. And they'll be looking at identifying nature-based solution sites, coming up with some design renderings, and then ultimately funding and implementing projects. And Katie and Amy have also been doing this work for a long time, so they have a lot of other experience with implementing green infrastructure. So they're also going to be sharing some of their lessons learned and tips in both the presentations that they deliver, but also the panel discussion. So after each presentation, we'll stop to briefly answer some clarifying questions, and then we'll move into a panel where we're going to dive deeper into some of the challenges that you all posed in registration, and then some additional tips that they may have around those keys to success. And this will be an opportunity for you to also pose some additional questions in the chat for them. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Katie Grantham. And Katie, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share yours, and then I'll introduce you here. All right, so Katie is a planner in the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, Environment and Infrastructure Group, primarily focused on watershed planning and education, air quality and solid waste activities across the region. She helps lead the collaborative One Water public education campaign and the COGS Coastal and Climate Resiliency Initiative. When Katie isn't working, you can find her kayaking and hiking all over Michigan. Sounds like a great time. So thank you so much, Katie, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk more about green infrastructure and really connecting it back to building coastal resilience within our communities. So the project I'm specifically going to be talking about today is this green infrastructure assessments along Southeast Michigan's coastline. And with that, we'll just go ahead and dive right in. So just to give you a little overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Semcog for those who might not be familiar with our organization and what we do. And then I'll talk about some of our regional coastal resilience work because it really ties into this green infrastructure assessments project that I'm going to be talking to you about. And I really want to focus today on engaging communities and how we've done that and why that's really important to having a successful project. So let's go ahead and dive in. Before we talk about our resilience work, again, I just wanted to introduce you all to Semcog. So the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments supports coordinated local planning with technical data and intergovernmental resources to over 120 units of local government, community colleges, and intermediate school districts in Southeast Michigan. And ultimately, our plans really function to improve the quality of the region's environmental resources, make the transportation system safer and more efficient, revitalize communities, and encourage economic development. And so at Semcog, I work in our environment and infrastructure team, and we like to stay very busy. So we've got a whole range of topics that we cover. If you're ever interested in talking with us about, a project or an idea that you have, we focus on green infrastructure implementation, water infrastructure coordination and asset management, climate resiliency, air quality, and public education. So a lot of different topics that we're involved with. So let's go ahead and dive in a little bit to this resilience work and what we're doing across our region and how it all kind of ties together. So we're currently working on addressing coastal resilience through a series of projects that really connect the different components of resilience capacity building. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is that Semcog, in partnership with the Land Information Access Association, otherwise known as LIA, we're currently wrapping up this coastal sustainability assessment for our coastal communities within our region. And this program is called the Planning for Resilient Communities program. And it's really there to help build it's really built to help citizens, local leaders, and public officials plan for communities that are more resilient to global challenges, such as climate variability, extreme weather events, and economic challenges. And so through this project, we really evaluated a community's master plan and zoning ordinances to get a better understanding of how their community is prepared for coastal hazards. And really a goal of this is also to address where there might be gaps and figure out how we can help a community prepare for, coastal hazards and what community improvements can be made through the planning process. Through this program, we were able to complete a heat vulnerability assessment for our region. And we were also able to map future flooding scenarios to understand how our coastlines might flood during extreme rain events and what critical infrastructure might be impacted. And so all of this was another program that's that's funded through the Coastal Management Program. And it really helped to give us our first introduction to our local communities and set them up for success moving forward. So while the LEO project that we've been working on really focused at the community scale, our green infrastructure site assessments, which I'm going to talk about shortly, are looking at specific sites. So we really are trying to take the data and the knowledge that we learned from this Resilient Michigan collaborative and really scale it down to this site-specific level. And so the next step that I'll kind of talk about throughout the presentation is that we really hope to get all these projects funded and take them through this life cycle planning. So, from starting at the very beginning phases to, actually going out and doing some, site assessments and engineering designs and taking it all the way to make sure that these projects get funded, because that's our goal at the end of the day, so that we can really have an impact across the region. Okay, so now that I've kind of talked about all of these different, resilience work and how it ties together, let's dive into this green infrastructure assessments project. So our goal is to build resilience in Southeast Michigan and help preserve coastlines and really mitigate the impacts of flooding on coastal communities. So through this grant, our project team identified high priority publicly owned properties, and we're really working to look at the feasibility for green infrastructure on these sites. So the primary outcome of the project will include about 10 to 15 concept plans using green infrastructure to strengthen coastal resilience. And these green infrastructure elements might include natural features. So these are things like shoreline softening projects or wetland enhancement projects, but it also consists of constructed features. So these are things like bioretention, permeable pavers, rain garden, or really any practice that could be used to manage runoff from impervious surfaces. And the concept plans that will be created, we hope will be eligible for future funding. So that's really kind of the end goal with this. And we're doing this in partnership with the Center for Watershed Protection. So I just really want to quickly introduce who they are, because I think it's a great resource for people on this call if you haven't heard of them. So they're a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1992, and they really work to advance clean water resources and healthy ecosystems through responsible land and water management. And they're currently national leaders on stormwater management and watershed planning. And so they really focus on 4 things, which are research, training, membership, and stormwater services. And we chose to partner with them because they just have a wealth of experience in green infrastructure. They've done a similar project out in Maryland, and we were really excited to bring their expertise to Southeast Michigan and the Great Lakes. So we really appreciate Greg and Jordan, who are part of that team who have been helping us along the way with this work. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the work we've made on this project so far and talk a little bit about the success and the lessons that we've learned. So a lot of you might know community engagement is key in making these projects successful, but it can be really challenging to engage local communities, especially when they have so much going on within their own community boundary. So we really tried to set ourselves up for success, and these are some of the things that we did that I just want to relate to all of you. So to start, we really wanted to make sure that we were in contact with the right people at an organization, a city, or a county who would be knowledgeable and willing to talk to us about green infrastructure implementation and future projects within their community. Oftentimes, we reached out to multiple people from a community to ensure that we were able to get the right folks interested and find a community delegate to participate in this project. We also produced, just like a simple one-pager. So anytime we were really at a meeting or, if there was an in-person meeting that we had, we were able to distribute information about our project in a succinct way and kind of pass the word on using that as well. And really, once we had people's attention and kind of had found those stakeholders, which we took a significant amount of time to really get that set up, we wanted to keep people engaged in the process. And so we developed a lot of different ways for people to interact with our team, to submit projects, to provide feedback on project selections, and really work with us as we move through this project. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides. You can see here, these are things like doing a survey 1, 2, 3, having meetings with breakout rooms, developing a story map, having field participation, and at the end of the day, it always helps to have funding as an end goal for a project. So this right here is an example, or is actually what we use to engage people in the process. And so we really developed this project solicitation template using survey 1, 2, 3, which for those of you who might be less familiar, is an ArcGIS program. And so this really allowed communities to start providing us with some information about areas where green infrastructure could be implemented, and how this work is tied in with, community objectives and policies and their vision for the future. And so if you're interested, there's a QR code. It should still be up. You're happy to take a look if you're ever interested in doing something like this yourselves. Really what was part of this survey is the ability to recommend projects. So you could basically go in and search for an address or location, and you could drop a pin like you see on the screen here. And then once you did that, you were able to provide us with more information that all got uploaded into GIS. We had all these points and we had all this data. And these were things like green infrastructure type, property ownership, because we wanted to make sure we were on public property. If there was any prior site planning, like maybe something happened a few years down the road and never went through, or just kind of giving us some of those little tidbits that we might not have been aware of. And then we gave them the ability to attach any planning documents as well. So we were able to kind of use this survey as a first step of reaching out to people. And then we ended up having 2 meetings this past March where we provided an overview of our project. And during this time, we talked through the project. And once we did this, we divided up into breakout rooms by county. And we really gave people an opportunity to suggest a project location while walking them through a mapping application that we had put together for the region. And so this map contained information on parks, publicly owned land, and showed vacant areas and just a lot more. So if a community hadn't really considered where green infrastructure could be placed along their shoreline, or they hadn't even thought of, a nature-based solution, it gave them some potential ideas and kind of allowed them to explore their community from an aerial view. So from both this, survey 1, 2, 3 that we did, as well as these breakout meetings, we were able to collect over 100 potential green infrastructure sites, which is significantly more than we thought we would get. And I think in giving people the ability to, submit ideas both digitally as well as in person worked really well. And so while we, couldn't actually get together and have an in-person meeting, because of COVID and because of concerns over that, having these breakout rooms really offered people a space to come and talk to us one-on-one. And just overall, I think everybody found it really valuable, if nothing else, to help establish those connections for future projects as well. So once a community had really provided us with this, potential project location, we worked with the Center for Watershed Protection to kind of narrow that list down to sites that really were feasible for field assessments. And so in creating this list, we really tried to make sure we had a good distribution of sites across our 4 counties within the Semcog region, with a large emphasis on the coastal boundary. And we also really tried to find a good balance between, shoreline projects and inland sites so that, we had a diversity of projects that would make a difference if they got implemented. So once we had kind of created this final list, it was time to involve those community representatives again. And so we developed an Arcgis Story Map, which you can see here, that really offered an insight into this project, why we're doing it, and allowed for them to once again interact with the sites that were submitted. And as part of the story map, we really had 2 forms. The first was really to link back to our original survey. So if anybody had an idea in mind, or they just found out about this project or whatever it be, they could submit it, because obviously it's really hard to say no to a great project. But we also included a Google form that community representatives could fill out if they wanted to come out and visit us while we were in the field. And so, while it's really critical to engage communities when visiting a project site, it was definitely challenging for us to figure out a good schedule, because so many people ended up wanting to come out with us when we were going out to do these site assessments. And so in the end, we really determined that we would allot about a 1-hour time frame in the morning and a 1-hour time frame in the afternoon. And so when reaching out to schedule these, specific times, we tried to politely emphasize to communities that, we really had a lot of sites that we needed to visit and other people to talk to. And so, we wanted to keep our schedules moving. And so we couldn't stay more than our allotted time slot, but overall, everyone was really respectful of our time, which brings me to talk about the field assessments. So for our field work, we wanted to keep this approach in mind. So just so you know what we were all thinking about, we were looking for publicly owned property, which we had largely identified at this point, but we might have had a few sites that were questionable when we went out into the field. We were looking for lots of impervious cover. It's obviously great if you have a large space that's underutilized that can take, great infrastructure and manage stormwater there. Space available to capture runoff from the impervious cover, and then shorelines that were in need of restoration. So whether that be, there's a lot of riprap, or whether that be, failing seawalls or whatever it be, we were looking for those opportunities when we were out there. And so we actually got to go out in the field last week, and we, wrapped up kind of this first round of field work. So there's really nothing like spending 10 hours out in the field on the hottest week of the year, right? But even the heat couldn't get us down, and we had a great time. We met with representatives from a good amount of communities, and we had planners, engineers, mayors, parks and recreation staff joining us as we kind of traversed down our coastline over a 4-day period. And during this time, we were able to get, anywhere between 32 to 35 sites finished up. So once we determined when we were on site that, there was a good place for a project, we would collect a bit of data using ArcGIS field maps. So this was things like drainage area, site measurements, proposed green infrastructure, all of that stuff. And then we would also draw out renderings of the current condition of the site. And we would mark, if there are any constraints. So if there were things like utilities or park amenities nearby, or just, any additional notes that we need to think about as we're, looking to develop a concept idea for green infrastructure on this site. So these are some of our next steps. We finished our first round of field work, but we've got another one coming in late July. And we're going to follow the same process. We'll be going out, meeting with communities, looking at all of these sites. And this time we'll be doing it for Wayne and Monroe counties. And then in this, in fall, we're going to start doing those concept plans. So we've got a ranking system kind of laid out that looks at, volume of stormwater treated or the length of shoreline restored, the cost per acre treated, the presence of implementation challenges, and then also really making sure that we're looking at equity and environmental justice. Semcog has done a lot of data analysis on this, so we'll be bringing that in to kind of rank these sites to figure out, what our top 12 to 15 sites are. And then we'll be developing these concept designs using CAD layout and cost estimates. And hopefully, all of this will wrap up by the end of the year, and we'll be able to provide that to communities. So with that, that's kind of my project. Hopefully I didn't take too much time, but I'm happy to answer any questions either now or, when we've got our panel later on. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was wonderful. If anyone has questions specifically about what Katie just shared, please feel free to put those in the chat. We will obviously dive into lots of questions during our panel interview. I thought it was really awesome that you talked about partnering with the Center for Watershed Protection, because they obviously do have a wealth of knowledge, and that's a great way to kind of set yourself up for like a long-term partnership. And I loved also hearing about how you were identifying and prioritizing projects. That's one of the challenges that we heard from folks, and loved your ways of using maps. That's something that we've done a lot at NOAA, is when we gather communities together, giving them maps is really a powerful tool to be able to really visualize the landscape and really generate just thinking, even if you don't totally use a map, just to generate that thinking of what's on the ground and what's a possibility. So we've always loved to use that as a way to get buy-in and encourage creativity. So very cool how you did all of this stuff remotely. So that was really creative, when you can't get together in person, to be able to continue the work and do it in a remote way. That was really neat to hear, and hopefully gave everybody some ideas of how they could do something similar with their partners and their community members. And so it looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat. So Jacob asked, would private lands be viable for green infrastructure as well in your project? How is that different from public planning?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for this specific project that we're looking at, we're really focused on public lands. One, because we need to access them to be able to do these site assessments. So sometimes if, there might have been a private land that we could have gone to, but getting a hold of, whoever the owner is, and then having access to the site is certainly a challenge. So it was just something that we weren't going to look at this time. The other challenge with private lands is that if there has to be something like acquisition to be able to, do something on that land, that often takes time, and sometimes there's not funding for that. So it's certainly possible, and I think private sites are great, and that's something that we're looking at in the larger Semcog spectrum of things. But at least for this project, that was something that we just decided that we weren't going to do.
Yep, thank you. And yeah, Jacob, I think also people on their own private property can always do green infrastructure. Right. So a lot of communities just try to do things like encourage, educate the community on green infrastructure and encourage kind of backyard green infrastructure work. So that's always an option too on private properties. So another question, can cities use your flood prediction model?
Yeah, so what I talked about with the LEA project, we're hoping to get a lot of that data online, in a story map and an interactive map. It basically just has 3 different scenarios. So it's not necessarily like you could input different measures, but you could just see, based on these different scenarios of, an extreme rain event, a normal rain event, or a low, rain event, where flooding might be. But we also do have a flooding risk tool at Semcog, and I'm happy to post a link in the chat to that, where you can look a little bit more at flooding along some of our important transportation and infrastructure assets throughout our region. So we've got a few different options for that.
Thanks, Katie. That would be great. Another question, are there plans for Semcog and to work in other Michigan communities?
Yes, so we really kind of span this 7-county region in Southeast Michigan. So we do have a lot of regional plans. We have a green infrastructure vision for Southeast Michigan, as well as a water resource plan. And so we have a lot of tools available through those, for communities to access. We would obviously love to expand this project, and we're kind of looking at some ways in which we can do that to look more holistically at green infrastructure throughout our region and not just at our coastal communities. So stay tuned for that, but we do mostly work in our 7-county region.
And then thank you, Katie. There was another question about if you found good opportunities along the coast for a project, because it's a lot, much of it is residential and developed. So just wondering if you found an opportunity, and if you're considering engaging private owners along the coast, which I think we just talked about, that you're looking more at public land, but wondering if you found some opportunities around the coastline.
We did. We found a lot of great opportunities. And I feel like if you go in and look at a site with a really open mind, especially when we were out there with Greg Hoffman with Center for Watershed Protection, we would all of a sudden just be like, oh, this would be amazing for, a stormwater project, or we could, include this whole area and manage runoff from the parking lot. But I think what I was surprised about when we were out in the field is that we found a lot of good sites to do some shoreline softening or implement a natural shoreline. You are certainly right, especially as we're going to get into, Wayne and Monroe County. And even when we were in Macomb, there's a lot of urbanization. It's built up all the way to our coastline. And, there's a lot more seawalls there. And it really becomes a challenge of if we can remove those or not. But we did really find some good opportunities to be able to do this work. So hopefully we'll be able to share all of that with you at a later date.
Great, thank you. And there are a few questions about concept designs. One, what happens after the concept design is one question.
Yes, great question. So we're hoping we have a few different potential funding sources that are coming down the pipe. We're also looking at, the infrastructure bill that passed and what's going to be coming from that. So really, once we finish the concept designs, we're hoping to, this summer and late fall, have a better grasp of what funding we'll have. And we will hopefully, if we start to have that in hand, then we'll be working with those communities and figuring out, who could do this engineering work and start really actually moving towards that implementation phase of things. So it's all obviously a little bit up in the air right now because there's, so much uncertainty with funding, but, I have a really good feeling that it's all going to kind of work its way. So by the time we finish this, we're going to be ready to go for implementation.
Great. And another question about if you're going to be creating concept designs for the top 12 to 15 projects, or rank or narrow those down further before doing the concept designs.
Yeah, so we're going to narrow everything down a little bit further. Each community will have, something that comes out of this, whether it be a very basic idea versus the top 12 to 15 will likely get a little bit more detailed concept plans and what that could look like, and, have a little bit of metrics when it comes to like how much, shoreline would be implemented or how much runoff would be captured. So those concept designs we're hoping will be kind of the first to move towards funding, but we, in doing this project, really want to have a collective list that we can still continue to work on while, we might not have something from this pot of money or something coming, we might have something coming down the road. We know, how we can get those implemented. So it's really kind of setting up a list of plans that are likely pretty ready to go and are gonna, make a really big difference. And then trying to get to all these other ones as we work on this for years to come.
Great. Yeah, and David had a great idea that for the projects that are not considered in the narrowed down concept design, could be an opportunity to do a design competition with local colleges or universities. So that's a great idea. And, we've heard from so many people that it's just important to have a list of projects, even if they're not all the way down to design, to have kind of that pipeline of project ideas that you can move forward with, when funding does become available. So just having all of those ideas is great. And I think we'll do one last question before we move on to Amy about funding. So I know that you're still trying to, you don't know for sure who is going to provide funding for the selected projects, but that was a question about what are the ideas you have around funding for the projects you're narrowing down.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're hoping to later this summer have finalized a project with EPA through GLRI, but I don't think I can speak too much to that right now, other than to say hopefully we'll be getting a pretty significant funding coming into Semcog so that we can do a sub-grant program. We've done this in the past, and I'll probably be talking about it during our panel today. Maybe we'll get funding from a Michigan Coastal Management Program. We also have things like a Transportation Alternatives Program where we might be able to sneak in some funding through there. And we have planning assistance grants as part of Semcog. So we have some funding at Semcog, and we know we have some federal funding coming in as well. There's also a lot of great resources like our Southeast Michigan Resilience Fund, which is through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Some of these projects might qualify for that. So we're kind of working on putting a big list together together. And hopefully, then we can move that forward. So a lot of those, applications come out in the fall. So hopefully we'll have some things ready to kind of move forward with that. Uh-oh.
Oh, sorry, got cut off there for a second. You never know. Okay, good. I'm back. So thank you so much. And yeah, we can, and I know there's other questions in the chat that maybe you can look at answering when we turn it over to Katie. But that's great. I mean, I know we've also heard from folks, there's so many different, pods of funding, but it's really important to identify your projects first and know what you really want to put in the ground, and then move into like what funding sources can help accomplish those goals. And we will mention, like I mentioned earlier, Bridget's going to talk about a funding webinar that is going to be hosted in July by our office. It's going to be focused around funding in the Great Lakes and some of the sources that you just mentioned. So we'll talk about that so that you all can register for that if you're interested in learning more about Great Lakes specific funding. So thank you so much, Katie. And now we're going to turn it over to Amy Navikoski. So Amy, while you are sharing your screen, I will introduce you. So Amy is the Coastal Project Manager for Huron Pines, a nonprofit organization that works to conserve and enhance Northern Michigan's natural resources. Amy lived in Wyoming for over a decade and worked as a hydrologist and fisheries biologist, where she designed and implemented aquatic habitat restoration projects. Amy is happy to be back in Northern Michigan, where she was born and raised, and works to conserve and enhance rivers and lakes, implementing clean water solutions by engaging communities and natural resource partners. Amy enjoys being outside and loves camping, biking, skiing, and kayaking. So thank you so much, Amy, for joining us and sharing your work.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to enter my slideshow. Okay, I can't see you any longer, but can you see my presentation okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
that's great.
Thank you, Lauren. So hello, everyone. I'm Amy Nowakowski, Coastal Project Manager at Huron Pines, and I'm really happy to be here today. And I'm going to be discussing several Huron Pines green infrastructure projects that address stormwater runoff and improve water quality in the Lake Huron Basin. So today I will begin with a brief overview of who is Huron Pines and our 3 program areas. Then I will walk through some of our green infrastructure projects, including a land protection project and several nature-based stormwater projects in various communities. And I will end the presentation today with a discussion on the binational Lake Huron Forever initiative. So Huron Pines is a nonprofit conservation organization. We've been operating for over 45 years, and we focus on natural resource protection and restoration. We partner with other organizations and municipalities, as well as community members, to implement a wide variety of natural resource projects. So our vision for the future of natural resources is conservation driven by engaged, empowered communities. So we have 3 program areas at Huron Pines, and the first is ensuring healthy water for people and wildlife. And we do this through river restoration, aquatic habitat connectivity projects, as well as stormwater management. And the second program area is protecting wild places. And we achieve this through land protection, invasive species control, as well as habitat restoration. And our third program is building vibrant communities with strong conservation ethics. Huron Pines, we strive to inspire a connection to conservation in everyone, to build vibrant, sustainable communities, rich with protected natural resources. So Huron Pines has completed many green infrastructure projects across Northern Michigan, but this map shows the project locations that I will highlight in today's presentation. And keep in mind that there are no MS4 regulated communities in this area. Therefore, all of these stormwater projects are voluntary and proactive. So our water is really clean, and we're aiming to keep it that way. And then beyond the points on this map, on a larger scale, Huron Pines, we work with partners throughout the Lake Huron watershed. So this includes kind of our traditional service area of the 12 counties in Northeast Michigan, as well as the Saginaw Bay region, the Eastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and Ontario, Canada. And as we all know, Lake Huron provides clean drinking water, incredible recreational opportunities, and a strong economy. And the shoreline of Lake Huron, it includes globally rare ecosystems with a lot of biodiversity, but of course there are regional threats that affect the sustainability of these ecosystems, as well as the quality of life in our communities. So that is why it's so important to improve the ecological health and sustainability of the whole Lake Huron watershed. So Huron Pines works with partners to protect natural infrastructure by protecting large areas of undeveloped land. And this allows for the natural function of ecosystem processes, which maintains the water cycle, provides groundwater recharge and clean water, as well as flood prevention and climate resilience. So the Lake Huron Coastal Preserve is one of Huron Pines' land conservation projects. And this project occurred just last year in 2021, and it permanently protects 145 acres, which is now a public nature preserve owned by the Alabaster Township. So this property encompasses forested wetlands, dune and swale habitats, and nearly a mile of Lake Huron shoreline. And now it's protected from future development. So one of the first Huron Pines stormwater projects was located in the town of Grayling, I believe in 2007. And this is the one inland community that was located on the map I showed in the previous slide. But the town is located on the Osable River, which flows into Lake Huron. So the project included a stormwater assessment of the existing infrastructure, which looked at some of the potential problem areas, and as well as provided recommendations for stormwater management. So the project also included designing and implementing some on-the-ground projects, including 86 rain gardens, which is a lot, and seven oil and grit separators within the city limits. So the rain gardens were constructed alongside city streets, and notches were cut into the existing curbs, which is called the curb cutout. And this helps direct water into the rain gardens where it can be filtered before it flows into water bodies. Oil and grit separators, they're structures that are built underground, either at or near outlets. It's basically a retrofit to an existing storm drain. And they're basically multi-chambered storage tanks that filter out oil and sediment. So this overall project, it did treat about 80% of the total stormwater runoff within the city limits. And it really resulted in a huge partnership between Huron Pines and the city of Grayling, the state of Michigan through the Non-Point Source Program, as well as many, many other organizations and local groups. So overall, this project captured stormwater and pollutants. It added green spaces in the community, and it helped to reduce the water temperature before the Osable River, which is a national wild and scenic river with a really important cold water trout fishery, as well as many recreational opportunities. Huron Pines has been working with the coastal community of Arcgis to improve the water quality, both in the Arcgis River, as well as Lake Huron. So a stormwater assessment was completed here, which was funded by the Coastal Management Program, as well as other funders and other organizations. So first, maps of the existing infrastructure were assessed, such as storm drains and outlets, and precipitation modeling was completed to estimate the volume of stormwater across different parts of the city. And a really, what I think is a really neat part of this project is that the Arcgis Sims High School environmental science class, they designed and implemented a rain garden on the school campus. So they went outside and they conducted measurements of the drainage area. They tested the soil water infiltration rate, and they measured other features such as the slope of the ground. And they presented their draft rain garden designs to community partners. And their designs included native plant selections, as well as an accessibility plan so people could actually get into the garden and enjoy it. And this garden was installed in 2019 with the help from the city as well as other conservation partners. And following up on their school campus rain garden, the same environmental science class, they designed additional projects within the city limits that were identified during the stormwater assessment. So they designed a bioswale in a city park and 2 large curb cutout bioswales along a city street. And I think my favorite part of this project is that the students grew many of the native plants for the bioswales. And they did this by collecting seeds from their first school rain garden project, and they grew the plants in their school greenhouse. So in this example, the students have really become long-term stewards of their green stormwater infrastructure projects, as well as in their communities. Huron Pines is partnering with the coastal community of Rogers City to improve their tree canopy. So as we all know, trees absorb excess rainwater and filter out pollutants to protect water quality. And trees also reduce the heat effect in downtown areas. And they also add to the beauty of downtown and public spaces. So we've completed several volunteer tree planting events. And we did this by partnering with the Presqu'île Conservation District Forester, who really helped us identify tree planting locations, as well as the selection of tree species. And in these volunteer events, I think the trees really helped create a sense of place and community pride for the many volunteers that participate in these events. And then lastly, in Rogers City, we're also currently working on an urban forestry project in partnership with the city, as well as arborists from Site Specific and Great Lakes Urban Forestry Management. So the arborists are completing a field inventory this summer to look at the location, size, species, and the condition of the trees in public spaces. And the arborists, they're also going to be providing training to city staff, helping with urban tree maintenance and planting guidance. And then a final urban forestry management plan will be developed with the goal of improving the health and the condition of trees in the urban area. So a current coastal management program grant is providing support for stormwater efforts in Alpena. And this is where I live. This is where I grew up. So it's a really important community to me personally. But Alpena sources its drinking water just offshore in Lake Huron. So here especially, it's really important to protect clean water. So we're partnering with the city of Alpena and the engineering firm Drummond Carpenter to develop conceptual green stormwater infrastructure designs. So we met just last week with city staff and some engineers from Drummond Carpenter, and we looked at a list of locations that the city provided to us. We focused on areas that the city recommended, including areas that are either flood prone or locations where future projects will take place. We looked at about 10 locations and took photos and discussed opportunities for designing nature-based solutions that would really capture and hold and infiltrate stormwater runoff. So we visited intentionally different types of locations, and the reason is we want to be able to apply these artistic renderings to other locations, whether it's in the city of Alpena or in other communities in the coastal area. So we went to a park, an alley that's being proposed to be closed. We went to parking lots, a beach and a shoreline area, as well as a concrete downtown plaza and a school. So next, the engineers from Drummond Carpenter will develop the artistic renderings for a handful of sites, showing what each site would look like if a green infrastructure project was installed. So each site will have multiple artistic renderings to help really the community visualize options. And this will be used to gauge interest from the community and help us prioritize potential options. So we're going to do this by engaging with the community through first a public engagement session that will be in person, where people can come hear about what is green infrastructure, and we can have people vote on what options they like best, both the locations as well as the designs. And we'll also be developing an online story map, so people that can't attend in person, they can vote online for what they like best. And this project has really been modeled off of previous work by Drummond Carpenter. As you can see in the slide, this is an example from Boyne City. And also they're currently working with the Tip of the Met Watershed Council to do the same type of artistic rendering project. And I believe their online story map for the city of Petoskey just went live. We're also completing a natural features overlay map for the Alpena area. And this really allows us to have additional conversations with our partners in Alpena and will lead to a more in-depth ordinance review. So in this process, we gather data on priority ecological features. This could be rivers, lakes, streams, riparian zones, wetlands, forested areas, or even public spaces. So these ecological features, they provide benefits to both people and the environment, such as water quality protection, rare species protection, as well as recreational opportunities. So the natural features shapefile will be overlaid with the existing zoning layers. And this will help us, we'll share it with our community partners, and will help to identify critical areas for future protection and restoration. So lastly, I want to end with the Lake Huron Forever initiative. And this was recently developed by partners both in the United States and Canada. And the objective is to advance water quality protection and have more sustainable communities throughout the Lake Huron Basin. So the effort not only aims to protect water quality, but also plant and animal diversity, and really strives to engage with communities across the region. And just this year, Arcgis became the first community to take the Lake Huron Forever pledge. And this community is really improving their stormwater management and protecting water quality, as we saw earlier in this presentation. And the community is engaging with citizens to take action, and they've committed to protecting Lake Huron forever. So the Lake Huron Forever program is made possible by contributions from many organizations that are listed here, including NOAA, EGLE, as well as the Coastal Management Program. So these partners not only provide funding support for this initiative, but they support projects that implement nature-based solutions for the sustainability of Lake Huron. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time today, and please let me know if you have any questions at all.
Thank you so much, Amy. Appreciate you sharing all that great information. And if anyone has questions for Amy, please put those in the chat and we'll get those answered. So I'll pause for just a moment to see if anyone has that before we move to the panel. But I loved, Amy, how you talked about not only kind of the green stormwater infrastructure that a lot of people associate with green infrastructure, but you also talked about the importance of protecting existing habitat, which I think is something that's not talked about quite as much when we talk about nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. A lot of times we have lots of stories about the stormwater piece or the shoreline piece, but also just thinking about conserving these existing habitats that we have. Really, that's kind of the first cut, right? Protect what you have existing, and then kind of think about how do we change our environment to help mimic those natural processes using some of those other techniques that might be more engineered. So I love that you mentioned that. And also, of course, great ideas around community engagement. Again, it's so neat to hear both you and Katie's ideas around community engagement and kind of what you're doing around that. Okay, so David has a question about getting landscape architects involved to upgrade design quality. So I think the question is, have you been working with landscape architects to do some of those design renderings?
So we've, like I mentioned in the presentation, been working with Don Carpenter from Drummond Carpenter, who might be on this call. I think I saw his name earlier. And I just want to give Don a ton of credit. It's been wonderful to work with him and his firm. And I think that has been really, really helpful, because not only does Drummond Carpenter have that experience and knowledge base in working with communities, locating sites, and figuring out how to engage with either city engineers or other types of partners, and prioritizing sites. It's been really, really wonderful. So I think finding people who have experience with green stormwater infrastructure, who can engage with partners, I think that is a key to project success, as well as the artistic renderings, because a lot of people, I think, that don't either have a background in engineering or kind of on the ground restoration projects, they can't visualize what a future project could look like in their community.
That's great. Thank you. And yeah, the importance of having partners that can help navigate all these different pieces. There's a lot of them when it comes to implementation of projects. And of course, I also want to mention, since we know, we have a lot of experts on the phone today, likely too. So if you have ideas to share or resources, please don't hesitate to use the chat to do that. It doesn't just need to be from the speakers and from us. So let's see. We have another question. Was just the high school involved in the bioswale rain garden projects, or have universities also shown interest in projects?
To the best of my knowledge, only the high school at this time, which again, it's been really cool to see a class evolve and starting with, designing their own rain garden and then having it keep going into building off of that first rain garden into future green infrastructure projects in the city and growing their own plants. But I like that idea of connecting with universities or, I think you have to start small with these projects and then having those bigger ideas, maybe it's connections to universities and thinking bigger, it's kind of like a really good snowball effect.
Absolutely. We hear that from a lot of folks. It's kind of starting small, getting these small successes and then building up. And Claudia mentioned, yes, especially engineering students. That was a barrier that someone mentioned, was making sure engineers are kind of bought into these concepts. And so obviously engaging engineering students right up front in some of these projects is a great opportunity to change some of the thinking. So thanks for that idea, Claudia. Chris asked about rare species protection and connection with fisheries co-benefits. Are those some of the considerations that helped you engage with the communities where you worked?
That's a great question. I think, from a Huron Pines perspective, that is really important for our organization. We think holistically, watershed scale, we think about people and communities, but we also think about those rare habitats, ecosystem function, and then, across Lake Huron, that's so big picture thinking. So I think that will come into play with the Alpena natural features overlay mapping.
Great, thank you. And then Jacob mentioned that they have done some green infrastructure projects on a university campus. So he is a resource to folks who are interested in thinking about that. Michael asked, are the Lake Huron organizations involved in the protection of the sinkholes, caves, and other karst? Is that how I say it? Landforms in the Alpena area?
Yeah, I love that question. I think that will fit really well into our natural features mapping because those are critical ecosystems. They're really rare. Some of which are globally rare in this ecosystem. Yeah, coastal dune and swales and coastal fens, and certainly sinkholes, which have a huge groundwater connection because everything goes right underground in those sinkholes. And there's a lot of them in Northeast Michigan, Alpena County and Presque Isle County. Yeah, try not to read the chats as they come in. That answers your question.
Great. Well, yes. Excuse me. And of course, everyone feel free to keep plugging in the chat. But I'll invite Katie back to the camera and we will do a little panel discussion. And of course, if anyone has questions in the chat for either Katie or Amy, please feel free to ask those and I'll try to keep my eye on those as well as some of our other questions. So excited to have you back on, Katie. So I wanted to obviously talk to both of you about kind of your keys to success, your lessons learned around some of the challenges that I'm sure you faced doing green infrastructure over the years. It's not just about this new project that you're kicking off, but you all have been working on this for a long time. So you've, I'm sure, learned about, had different lessons learned over the years. So feel free to answer these questions as you're thinking about your new projects or existing ones you've worked on. But I had a few questions around incorporating local considerations into design and selection. I know you all shared quite a bit on how you look at design and how you select projects. Katie, you did mention that you bring engineers out into the field with you. And just because this was a challenge mentioned, I just want to see if that is something that's helped you be successful in or maybe the engineers were already on board with these projects and so you didn't need to really worry about that. But was that helpful bringing them out into the field with you as you guys were trying to pick which projects you wanted to select for implementation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Greg Hoffman with the Center for Watershed Protection is an engineer. And so when we went out and did these site assessments, he was really kind to come down from the UP where he lives and come out into the field with us. And so I do think that was really helpful. I have a little bit more of an ecologist background. And then he kind of had the engineering. And so together, you know, we were really able to look at a site and figure out, you know, how we could maximize benefits. And so I also think he was really helpful. Community seemed to really listen. You know, when we went out there, he was really good at, you know, providing like, okay, you know, this is what it could look like. This is where water is going to flow, all of that stuff. And so, you know, once the community was like, oh, this parking lot's not going to flood anymore. And, you know, it was explained to me in a really nice way. They definitely seemed to have buy-in. But I think in terms of like other projects, we're lucky that we have in our region a lot of great engineers who are also involved in watershed planning. And so, you know, sometimes they've already been involved with a project or they know they're going to get tied in, so they've been willing to come out with us. But yeah, as much as, you know, we're able to involve like a team of people, I think that really helps make a project successful. But I also realize that can certainly be challenging too.
Thanks, Katie. And Amy, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add about kind of bringing teams of folks out into the field.
Yeah, I'll kind of repeat myself maybe, but when we did our Alpena city site visits looking at potential sites, we were with Don Carpenter, and, you know, having him there and the expertise of, you know, potential options was really, really great. And thinking through kind of some of the sites, we just happened to stop. We were driving through town and we were like, oh, look at that site. Let's stop and look at this one, even though it's not on our list. So that was another great added benefit to visiting sites in the field. And I think one thing that was really helpful was meeting with the city of Alpena in advance and getting their list of potential sites that they're concerned with. Again, whether they're flood prone areas or whether they're sites that are going to be replaced. But one thing that struck out to me when we looked at sites, some of the sites were going to be replaced this summer. So we were a little bit behind if we're going to do artistic renderings and community visioning and, you know, develop full engineering plans and find funding for implementation. So those this year's sites really didn't work, but really engaging with the city and finding out when is the timing for some of their new either infrastructure projects, when are they going to be done? If they're 5 years out, those would fit better for some opportunities to develop or implement green infrastructure.
Great. Yep. Thank you so much. And I know both of you are really focused more on public properties, but you know, so someone in the chat did ask if you have any tips on helping private property owners just kind of know what they could do on their property.
So here on Pines, we do a lot of private landowner consultation or site visits. I have not done any for stormwater specifically, but a lot of, you know, invasive species management, habitat restoration, you know, how to improve land ecologically, river restoration, all kinds of things. So again, if you're on the call and you're located in the 12 counties in Northeast Michigan, that's in our traditional service area, and reach out to me and whatever you want help with, I can put you in touch with the expert at Huron Pines.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add to that, at least in the Southeast Michigan region, I would say our watershed councils are an extremely helpful resource. So, you know, figure out which watershed you live in and feel free to reach out to them. You know, a great example is that Friends of the Rouge, who works along the Rouge River watershed. They have, you know, even services where you could, they can come to your house and install, you know, a bioswale or a rain garden, or even have like a consultant come out and take a look and maybe provide you with some guidance moving forward. And there are also things like the Master Rain Gardener program that we have in our region that's put on by Washtenaw County and is kind of in partnership with all the watershed councils. So there's a lot of great resources that they have. But I would also say too, we have our One Water campaign, which is kind of like a collective of those resources. So if you go to mi1water.org, you can probably be linked to whoever you need to get in contact with. And we've got a lot of great tips and tricks if you're trying to think about, putting something in like a rain garden, a bioswale, anything like that on your site. So, we really in Southeast Michigan focus on stormwater management, especially for those who are in, combined sewer areas or separated areas. So yeah, lots of great resources.
Great, thank you so much, Katie. And I want to move in a moment into maintenance, but before I do that, there was a question in the Q&A and in the chat asking about Saginaw Bay, is an area of concern under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Has Huron Pines done anything with beneficial use impairment?
That's a great question.
You, Amy.
Yeah. Not to my knowledge. I can find out for you though. So we do partner with different organizations in Saginaw Bay, but the actual, I'm trying to look at a county map on my wall here. It's not in our traditional service area, but I don't know who made that comment, but if you want to reach out to me, I can try and find out the answer for you.
Sorry about that. I got disconnected. So I was gone for a moment there. And okay, so great. So I would love to move on to maintenance a little bit. That was one of the challenges provided by participants in advance of the training, that is, can be an issue, of course. So I was wondering from both of you, how have you approached maintenance in your project? Did you bring people that might be doing the maintenance into the project sites as you were designing them? Or, do you have any tips and lessons learned around that piece, whether it comes to funding or involving maintenance staff, any of those things?
Amy, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Doesn't matter to me. Yeah, I was like, either way, you can start and then I'll follow up with some.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, maintenance is a challenge. And a lot of times when communities are looking to apply for a grant, that grant doesn't necessarily fund maintenance down the road. And actually, when we were out in the field last week, Greg Hoffman had, a great quote that he had gotten from a webinar. So I'll pass it along to this webinar, which is that, the first day that, a great infrastructure site is constructed, it's, at its best. But the first day that a great infrastructure site is constructed, it's probably at its worst because, these plants need to establish and that takes time. And I mean, if anybody's a gardener out there and you think about, how much time it takes to do, to really raise these plants and have, them be productive and stuff, it's a lot. And so we really need to have funding for maintenance. And at least from Semcog's perspective, what we've tried to do, and this is specifically for this Great Lakes Restoration Initiative sub-grant program that we had funding to give out to implement green infrastructure projects. And so we did require that, when grantees were submitting these applications, that they provide us with a maintenance plan for at least 3 years down the road so that we can know that, we can at least start that establishment. But it is really challenging because some of the sites that we were out, seeing when we were in the field last week, there had been a bioswale or a rain garden or whatever that be constructed in the field. But a lot of, invasives have come into that area or, might just not look its best, even if it is functioning to this, day. But it's definitely a challenge because sometimes, when we implement a bioswale or if you have to put in an under drain or whatever that be, if that gets clogged, then it doesn't function. And so figured out maintenance is a real challenge. I think if you can address it up front, that at least helps provide some guidance moving forward. But I do think, communities, that was something we consistently heard is that, we wish we had funding for maintenance because we just don't have the staff capacity to come out, or we rely only on students to come out during the summers or whatever that be. So I think there's a lot of different components of it, but it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Katie. And the hard part for me is when maintenance becomes an obstacle to implement, you know, I mean, it's important to have a maintenance plan during the design phase. And that didn't happen, I don't think, in the early projects. So like the example I gave in the community of Grayling, 86 rain gardens, that's a lot. It's fantastic. And to the best of my knowledge, many are not being maintained. They still, like you said, they still function. They're bioswales, they're collecting and filtering water, but they don't have the added benefits of beautification and pollinator gardens and things like that. And so now our implementation projects for green infrastructure, they do include a maintenance plan, but it might not be as long-term as it needs to be. And that is a challenge. I think there's opportunities to connect with local garden clubs or people that are already volunteering, but it's hard to add on a lot of new gardens to maintain for volunteers. But there's, I think with any challenge, no matter what it is in the world, there's opportunities. And so I see this maintenance challenge as, you know, there could be opportunities to work with local DPWs, which are also small and have staff challenges. But if we could potentially in the future shift their current maintenance of mowing lawns to maintaining more rain gardens, I think that's an opportunity. And we could also design rain gardens a little bit differently, like we could use more rock and less mulch. One idea that I got from Don Carpenter on our site visit in Alpena last week was to design a wet prairie meadow. And so those you just need to mow once a year. So less maintenance. And there's also other things like more trees or building tree trenches and some different design opportunities that are worth discussing with partners who just might be opposed to green infrastructure options because of maintenance concerns.
Great, thank you for sharing some potential ideas around maintenance. I know it's a big obstacle. There were some resources put in the chat as well, and some ideas about establishing maintenance maybe as part of a curriculum at schools and universities. But I know that we've heard from people in the past just that, yeah, like sometimes working with your public works to do maintenance, especially if the function that you're trying to provide through green infrastructure is kind of like a public works function, or, you know, so it's kind of just like changing that mindset of you know, you're putting a different type of infrastructure in to do something that you maybe traditionally would do with kind of your normal pipes and gray infrastructure. So that's really helpful and something that I think we're all working toward and trying to get in. I love your idea, Amy, about also thinking about design and maybe doing simpler design sometimes. So sometimes it's not going to look exactly like this awesome garden we were thinking, but it might be a little bit more wild, or you might be putting in things that are just a little bit easier to maintain. Because I know plants also look different. Sometimes things look like weeds and they're not weeds and they get pulled. And so there's all those kind of different challenges too. And so we've heard from folks too, of just providing specific kind of checklists of here are the plants we have in here, here's what you do with them, and here's what you know, here's the ones you leave alone, kind of things like that. So just wanted to add in a little bit based on what we've heard from other folks over the years. So I was also wondering about, you know, both, you know, you all talked about kind of community planning efforts that are, you know, incorporating green infrastructure so that you're really aligned with your goals. But I was wondering a little bit more about permitting and regulations, if you've had any barriers around permitting, or if you have any tips for folks who might be trying to permit projects.
Katie, I'll let you start. I don't have a lot of firsthand experience with that. And the only kind of, it's not permitting, but ordinance thing we have run into is some plant height ordinances. So in that case, we just select shorter growing plants. But go ahead, Katie, I'll turn it over to you.
No, I was going to say the same, Amy. I truthfully don't have a lot of firsthand experience with permitting, but certainly when it comes to things like local green infrastructure ordinances, that can definitely be a barrier to implementation. Sometimes exactly what you were saying, Amy, sometimes there's height of plant issues. Sometimes a community might have a really strict set of guidelines for what can be planted, and that's not always native plants. Sometimes that's more ornamentals or what looks nice in that area, and so that might not consider some of the ecological benefits of putting in a pollinator garden or a rain garden. And so Michigan Sea Grant actually does have a guidebook online that I can try and post it in the chat, but I think that's a really excellent resource, because that kind of helps the community look through their ordinances and see if there are things that they can relax to be able to allow some different types of green infrastructure and some different plantings to come in, so that we're kind of maximizing a lot of these ecosystem benefits. The other thing I would say too is that, in our region, at the very least, a lot of folks have been working on putting together some regional stormwater standards. And so hoping to kind of develop some consistency across our different counties, so that, as we're thinking about new developments and, what they might be implementing in terms of green infrastructure might be required to implement, we can be consistent across the board, and still tie in, with all people's permitting and regulations.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. And then I was also wondering, when it comes, you both talked a lot about engaging the community members, and that was a barrier provided in registration, was just getting community buy-in. And you both are doing awesome stuff to help make sure that you're hearing from your community members and getting their ideas. I was curious about, you're using a lot of maps and things like that to get ideas and rendering. But how do you incorporate kind of those multiple values and get input from your community on maybe not only like where they'd like to see something or what they'd like to see, but kind of how do you help them think about the other benefits of green infrastructure to help them kind of choose ideas, whether it's recreation or maybe they're looking for more shade or things like that, some of those additional benefits. How do you kind of incorporate that into your work?
So one thing that Huron Pines has done with many communities, more than I listed during today's presentation, is to have community input sessions. And we kind of target it toward municipal leaders or really active groups in the community to describe, the benefits of green infrastructure, things from what we've talked about today, but more things too, like permeable pavement or pavers or green roofs. So kind of exploring all options. And then we usually go through a mapping session with the community leaders. And really, it's a great opportunity for them to ask questions, and we can get feedback and really draw on the community values or maybe challenges that communities are dealing with.
Yeah, Amy, just to even build off of what you said, these, meeting sessions that we had for our project, I feel like was really a time for us to solicit some of that information about what a community is working towards and their targets. And even being out in the field, I think that was a really good opportunity to talk to people one-on-one and say, what are you looking for? Like, a great example is that we went and looked at a project that was behind a wastewater treatment area, but there was a large amount of green space all the way leading up to their coastline. And it was the perfect place to put it in access point. And all of a sudden we're standing out there and we're like, this could be a pocket park. Like, this would be great. And this ties to, some of these other things we've wanted for our community. We want to have, more access to our coastline and stuff. So I really can't stress the importance of having those meetings, of going out and meeting with community members. And that's, a great way to build trust, but also to hear, what their needs are. And, I think that's something that we're a large regional entity, and sometimes that can be challenging to do for us. We're always, in communication with people's local governments. And working with them on all of these regional plans that we developed, but being able to go out and actually hear people's voices and get to spend some time in the community, I think has been just so beneficial. And I know we'd like to do more of that. So
thank you, Katie. And thank you, everybody. I see some great resources being shared in the chat. So I love that, because we have, we're hoping with this training today that you all connect with each other and kind of share different expertise and information. So thanks for keeping that going. So before we wrap up, and you may have already shared kind of your final thought, Amy, or Katie, but you might have others, but are there any final tips or lessons learned that you would want to share with all of our participants today that you haven't had a chance to emphasize yet?
Yeah, I think especially when you're considering new partners or new project ideas like green stormwater infrastructure. A lot of people hear that term and they're like, what is that? But I think when you're working on that with new partners, it's really important to be patient. Because change takes time. Developing trust, like Katie said earlier, that's a really important part of these projects and getting to the implementation phase. And that all really takes time, but you can build off experts, like working with engineers who have experience with these types of projects. There's so much information online on these types of projects. And what was I going to say? Oh yeah, also like building off of local champions. If you have people in your community who can help spread the message of the importance on green infrastructure, that is really key as well. So yeah, I think those are my final thoughts. Be patient, but be persistent as well.
Thank you, Amy.
That was great, Amy. I don't know how I can follow that up. I think it's so true. I really feel like community engagement is really that first step, and it opens a lot of doors for you to work with these communities in the future as well. After having been out in the field all of last week, I came back to my inbox on Monday, and all of a sudden I have more questions, other project ideas, all of this good information. And so really taking the time to establish those relationships can lead to a lot more good work that will happen in the future. So yeah, I love what you said, Amy. It definitely takes time. It takes a lot of patience, but doing it is really critical. And I think the other thing I would say is, as we're doing all of this work, I just think it's really important for us to think about climate resiliency and some of these hazards that are coming ahead and what that means for communities, and taking the time to really think through these projects so that their impacts are long lasting and are really serving communities into this kind of, unknown future that we're going into. And I think having a great team of, stakeholders and people involved in stuff can really lead to success and resiliency moving to the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. And thank you both so much for sharing your expertise and your ideas and all of your tips and everything that you have worked on. We really appreciate. We're excited to see these new projects that you're working on and come to fruition. And just thank you so much for being here today, sharing your expertise with everyone. So I think I'm going to turn it over back to Bridget to wrap us up by sharing some additional resources to help with some of the challenges that you all talked about, and hopefully help push things forward. So Bridget, I'll let you share your screen and move us forward. Thank you. And you are muted, Bridget.
All right. Can you see my screen and am I unmuted?
Yes.
Excellent.
We can see you and hear you.
Super wonderful. So here are just some resources that we wanted to share with you. I know we've gone through a lot of information, but there are a couple of things that we thought would be particularly of interest to you. And one of them is an upcoming webinar that NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, the office that we work for, is going to be holding in mid-July. So it's going to be about funding opportunities. And this will help you get a better understanding of what opportunities or resources are available. We talked about funding today. We talked about funding for maintenance, et cetera. And the funders on this webinar will be NOAA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and the Grand Traverse Regional Community Foundation will also offer some perspectives on how local foundations complement their national counterparts. So you'll learn details about the different funding programs, including the timeline and examples of successful funded projects, and be able to have a dedicated question and answer session as well. And I think, Lauren, if you could drop the link for the registration into the chat so that people can find that, that would be great. And another option, again, in the funding and financing realm, is this is just a quick reference on the Digital Coast, which is our website. that gives you some ideas on how to fund with different funding approaches. And in there, you'll also see a link to the webinar series, which we have a funding and financing webinar training as well. And our office is going to host another webinar that includes project from the Great Lakes, but also from the New England area, but cold climate approaches, dealing with ice, dealing with severe winter conditions, plants that have to be tolerant of all these extremes. So these two projects that will be featured in this webinar are nature-based shoreline techniques for the Great Lakes and monitoring and understanding the effectiveness of the shoreline approaches in New England. So both will have examples and both have a new guide that will be, or one has a new guide for the Great Lakes that will be highlighted. And Lauren if you could drop the registration link into the chat, that would be awesome too. And this is this is from Ontario. So this is from all different 17 different types of resources, different types of green infrastructure or nature-based solutions that you can look at. And it talks about charts which show which ecosystem service each of these offers. And they also have these before and after renderings that show kind of the street before with no trees and it's really hot and dry and no impervious surface, and then the makeover. And I think that is a really cool and useful thing for that resource as well. And then there is also this monitoring. So if you are charged with doing monitoring on projects, this is from New York, but it still includes the Great Lakes and looks at effectiveness monitoring for all these different strategies. So dune restoration, kind of a rock rebatment, different approaches, artificial reefs, plantings, wetland restoration, oyster restoration, which doesn't apply, but some very useful nature-based solution monitoring guidelines. And we talked a little bit about the ordinances and how to get your ordinances to line up and to be accommodating to green infrastructure. And this is a guide from Wisconsin that can help you look at your own regulations for your municipality and identify ways to make it more supportive of green infrastructure. So this is a useful link as well, a useful resource as well. And this is our landing page for the natural infrastructure part of the Digital Coast. And this is where you may have gone here if you were doing the training. That was part one of this training. And there are a ton of resources that you can get into here. And we don't have time to go over all of them. And I want to make sure that Ryan gets a chance. He had some closing comments. So I'm going to ask everyone in the chat if you could share one next step you plan to take after this training. And then I'm going to put a survey link in the chat as well, if you could fill that out to help us do our training better in the future. That would be super helpful. And then I want to turn it over to Ryan so he had some closing thoughts. So I'm going to switch over to that. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Bridget. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with a couple things and let you know you'll be receiving a couple things from us. You'll be receiving an email that'll have a certificate for continuing education hours, along to a link to the survey, which I believe is going to make its way into the chat, along with some additional resources that you'll find helpful. And you'll then be receiving a second email that will include the recording to the webinar, or actually a link to the recording where you will be able to access it and share it or watch this webinar again. So, but I think that's all I had. So if we're all set, I think we are. So with that, yeah, thanks to all of our presenters for the presentations they provided today and the great discussion that we had, and for all of you for participating who are attendees in the discussions in the chat. So with that, hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll catch you at the next one.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for hosting us, Ryan.
Yep, no problem. Thank you.